Hi, today we're going to talk about freshwater and focus on ponds, lakes, and wetlands. Ponds and lakes can range in size. They can be just a few square meters or up to thousands of square kilometers. Ponds might just be seasonal, maybe lasting only a couple of months and then not existing anymore, while lakes can exist for a lot longer, sometimes hundreds of years or more. Both of these might tend to have limited species diversity sometimes because they're isolated from one another and from other water sources like rivers and oceans. So if a lake or a pond is cut off from a river source, then often you will have pretty limited species diversity. Temperatures in both ponds and lakes varies seasonally. In the summer, it can range from about 4 degrees Celsius near the bottom all the way up to as warm as 22 degrees Celsius near the top. And then in the winter, it can be, again, about 4 degrees Celsius on the bottom, but the top can be 0 degrees, which is frozen. The narrow zone between the top and the bottom layers we call the thermocline. During the spring and fall seasons, the top and bottom layers tend to mix, and this results in a uniform water temperature of around 4 degrees Celsius. This mixing also circulates oxygen throughout the lake. Many lakes and ponds do not freeze during the winter, which results in the top layer being a little bit warmer. And here in Michigan, we see lots of examples of ponds and lakes freezing on the top during the winter. There are many different types of lakes that we're going to talk about: kettle lakes, tarn lakes, natural reservoirs, man-made reservoirs, oxbow lakes, and crater lakes. And we see many of these in the local area. Most lakes in Michigan could be described as kettle lakes, and the term kettle lake describes the way that the lake basin itself was formed. Kettle lake basins were formed as the glaciers receded. While this was happening, a block of ice broke off the glacier and just sat there. As the glacier continued to melt, the debris from the glacier, like soil and rocks and stones and that kind of thing, filled in around the block of ice. When the block of ice finally melted, all the debris surrounding it fell into the hole, creating the kettle-type basin, which then filled with water and then became a lake as we know it. Many of our small, deep lakes in Michigan are kettle lakes. Some have since been infilled with vegetation and plant matter, and then they form what we call bogs. Even some of our larger deep lakes, like Higgin Lake and Walled Lake that you might have heard of, are kettles. A tarn is also known as a mountain lake, and this is formed by a retreating glacier. And the types of glaciers that we see in mountain areas are called alpine glaciers. And so when these alpine glaciers retreat, they excavate what's called a cirque, which is a depression like you see here. And it's formed when either then rain or river water fills that cirque. And sometimes you might have a moraine like we see here, which is debris left over, that might form a natural dam below the tarn to kind of help it form into a lake. When the natural drainage of a river is blocked by debris, possibly from maybe volcanic activity, a landslide, maybe beaver activity, or ice, then we have what's called a natural reservoir. So these form naturally and form from debris blocking an area and kind of damming up that area, and then a lake forms there. In contrast to some of the natural processes that we were just talking about with lake formation, man-made reservoirs are made by humans, usually formed by constructing a dam across a flowing river. Upon completion of the dam, the river pools up behind the dam and fills in that artificially created basin. A dam is also sometimes constructed on an outlet channel of a natural lake as a means of providing maybe better control of the lake water level. And typically, though, those types of water bodies retain their natural lake characteristics. Reservoirs are primarily found in areas that don't have very many naturally occurring lakes. And although many different types of lakes are used for lots of the same purposes as man-made reservoirs, a distinct feature of these reservoirs is that they're usually built by humans to address one or more specific water needs. An oxbow lake is formed when a river creates a meander due to the rivers eroding the bank through hydraulic action, abrasion, and corrosion. After a long period of time, the meander becomes very curved like we see in the picture here. And eventually the neck of the meander gets cut off and becomes narrower and narrower like we see here, and then eventually gets cut off sometimes during a flood. And then we have what's called an oxbow lake. And we can see one in this map here. We can see that this river used to meander along this way, then eventually it was cut off here, and so we have an oxbow lake forming right there. Crater lakes form as the created depression within the crater rim is filled by water. The water might come from precipitation, groundwater circulation, or melted ice. Its levels rise until an equilibrium is reached between the rate of incoming and outgoing water. Often these are formed from volcanic activity, the craters themselves from volcanic activity, or sometimes possibly impact craters from maybe a meteor impact. And so we see two examples right here. Now let's talk a little bit about changes within a lake. One type of change that we see is seasonal, and this is because seasonally the temperatures change, and so then water density changes. So here we see in the summertime we're going to have warmer water on the top, and so what's going to happen is the lakes are going to turn that water over from top to the bottom as we enter into fall, and that water starts to cool off and become more dense. And this is actually a very important process called lake turnover, and this refreshes oxygen and nutrients within the lake. The process that we see here is called eutrophication, and sometimes bodies of water acquire a high concentration of nutrients, especially phosphates and nitrates. And we're going to talk in class and do a whole lab on how this affects algae growth. And what happens when these nutrients enter into a lake is they typically promote excessive growth of algae. Then as the algae die and decompose, high levels of organic matter and the decomposing organisms deplete the water of available oxygen, and this causes the death of other organisms like fish. Eutrophication is a natural process sometimes, but it happens very slowly naturally in a water body, but human activity can greatly speed up the process. Here's a picture with two pictures side by side with a healthy ecosystem here on the left and a eutrophic ecosystem here on the right. And what we see here on the right is increased sediments and nutrient loads from farming, urban development, water treatment plants, and industry. And these things trigger this microalgae to bloom, to grow at very high capacities. And this causes decreased water clarity, which causes less light to penetrate, which means less dissolved oxygen. And we see these X's here are different organisms that aren't able to survive under those conditions. Now let's take a look at a quick clip that will help explain this process. Now I'd like to take a look at some different sources of eutrophication. So I'd like you to pause the video for a moment and read through these different components here. And you're going to recognize a lot of them from the watershed model that we did in class. Now let's take a few minutes to talk about wetlands. Wetland scientists and others now recognize that wetlands are distinct ecosystems that are highly connected with other ecosystems, like other aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. And we define a wetland as a land area that's covered with a very shallow layer of water during either some of the year or sometimes all of the year. Wetlands are part of the foundation of our nation's water resources, and they're very, very vital to the health of waterways and other communities that are downstream from them. They feed downstream waters, they trap floodwaters, they recharge groundwater supplies, they remove pollution, and they provide fish and wildlife habitat. They are often found alongside waterways and in floodplains. There are several different types of wetlands, and we see some of these around Michigan. We have swamps, we see marshes here, bogs, and fens. Wetlands have some very important ecological functions. Hydrology-wise, they discharge and recharge groundwater. They regulate surface water flows and sedimentation. They also can transform or sequester nutrients and chemical contaminants. So when we're talking about that process of eutrophication in lakes and ponds, wetlands can be very important in trapping those nutrients, and they kind of act like a sponge and soak some of those pollutants up. They also provide very important biological diversity and recreation and important habitats for different organisms. And they also provide food and water products as well. That's it for our video on ponds, lakes, and wetlands. Thanks for watching.